listening to Second Wind with Joyce Buford, where women who are ready to expand their life adventure discover the tools to stop playing small and tap into the courage required to enjoy their second wind. Welcome.
Welcome to Second Wind. You are listening to Second Wind with Joyce, and I am Joyce. Now, I created this podcast because I wanted to encourage you to play full out when you go through your major life transition. But you have to start with getting to know yourself. And part of that is asking big questions and listening like you were sitting around a campfire, listening to other people tell their stories. So to be inspired, you have to dream big, and I mean dream outside of your comfort zone, okay, to where you want to go. And to inform you of how to get through this second wind experience, I have awesome guests. They approach you from all different areas of your life. They will help you transition through your transition by telling their stories and sharing their knowledge. And so you can make a smoother journey in your life. I will tell you, this is my little clue for you. It's all about reaching out for connection and support. So let me tell you where we're focusing today. This is indeed a major area in many people's lives. Adolescent substance abuse. You're going to hear about which drugs are today's teens using and seeking out, warning signs every parent should know, and if a parent suspects their child is using a substance, what's the first step to do? How has the pandemic impacted teen mental health and compulsive behaviors? And then what treatment options you have out there for your teens? All very, very important questions. So the man that's going to bring some of those answers to us today is Richard Capriola. And he has been a mental health and addictions counselor for over 2 decades. He recently retired from Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas. Congratulations, Richard. Where for over a decade, he treated adolescents and adults diagnosed with substance abuse issues. He is the author of a new book for parents entitled The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. He not only created this book, but he also created a workbook to go with the book, which has got to be very helpful. He lives with his wife in Katy, Texas, a suburb of Houston. He enjoys reading, writing, traveling, and spending more time with his family in Texas and both coasts. He has 1 son, 2 stepchildren, and 4 grandchildren. You are a lucky man.
Thank you. Yes, I feel very blessed. Thank you, Joyce. Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to the program.
Oh, your subject. I mean, honestly, I don't believe there's a family that hasn't been touched by addiction. I know it was part of my life in my previous life. And so it's just such a prevalent part of our lives. So I just appreciate that you spent so much of your life giving back to so many people. But tell me how you were really drawn to this subject, because what was the moment you said, this is where I want to spend my time, you know?
I think it was after sitting down with so many families and going through their child's history of using a substance and giving them the details and the diagnosis. And when I had finished going through their child's history, many times they would look across at me and they would say, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect their child was using a substance, they would say, I sort of knew something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. So when I left Menninger, I wanted to put this resource together for parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, anybody who wants to know more about this subject. And
Mhm.
I packed it all into about 100 pages because I know
Really?
people don't have a lot of time to read volumes of information on this.
No.
So I wanted to keep it short and concise, but I wanted to pack it with a lot of information that would help people understand um, adolescent substance abuse, how these drugs work in the teen brain, what the warning signs are.
Yeah.
And if you're in a situation where either you or someone you know is struggling with this issue, what are the options? What are the treatment options are out there, and where can you turn? Hoping that by reading this book, parents and other people would just feel more confident about this issue, not be so afraid of it, but just feel more confident. Hope that they never have to deal with it. But if they do, they feel better prepared to deal with it now.
Yes, yes. What type, what would be the description of a child that a teenager that is drawn to the use of drugs? Is it peer pressure? Is it, I mean, there's so many different things, but is there an overall kind of a common?
Well, I think that, first of all, no child is immune from being captured by drugs.
Yeah.
Every child is vulnerable. It doesn't matter where you live, urban, suburban, rural area. It doesn't matter what school your child goes to. It doesn't matter what your income level is. Every child is vulnerable. Now, how a child gets caught up in drugs, there's many different routes. Some of it is through peer pressure and the kids that they're hanging out with. Some of it is just out of curiosity. Maybe they've heard about it and they want to try it out and see how it goes.
Mhm.
And in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, there's an underlying mental health issue that child is using a substance to medicate. For example,
Wow.
many of the kids that I worked with who were smoking marijuana multiple times a day, when I
Mhm.
asked them to help me understand why they were smoking so much marijuana, the number one answer that came back was, it helps me with my anxiety. So for some kids,
Ah,
not all kids, but for some kids, there may be this underlying issue of anxiety, depression, some type of trauma, maybe being bullied at school.
yes.
And they have found that by using a substance like marijuana, it helps medicate and relieve that issue. So
Yeah.
every kid is different. Every
Right.
route is
Right.
different, and every reason is different.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think of marijuana being one of the strongest ones, but most active drug. But as I say, I've been on the outskirts of this world, and you have been in the center. So, is that still the most prevalent drug that you see in teens?
Yes, alcohol and marijuana. Alcohol and marijuana are the two primary substances that teens are attracted to. They by far are being used more than any other substance. There is some limited use of the more hardcore drugs like cocaine and LSD and some of the prescription drugs, but they tend to be less than 5% of kids. The majority of kids are using either alcohol are either using alcohol or marijuana. But what we
Mhm.
have noticed in the last 3 years has been a dramatic increase in what is called vaping. And that's where they will
Oh,
take a substance or use an instrument and they will turn it into a vapor and then inhale it. And in the last 3 years, the percentage of high school seniors that are vaping marijuana and vaping nicotine has increased dramatically.
wow. Well, they sort of sold that product as it was safer for you to vape
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
didn't they?
They did, and kids will tell you sometimes that it is safer than smoking cigarettes.
Mhm.
Smoking cigarettes is at an all-time low which is good.
Yeah.
But they will tell you it's safer. And in a way, they're right, because when they smoke cigarettes, they're getting not just tobacco, but they're getting hundreds of other chemicals in the tobacco as well. With the vaping, they're getting just nicotine. But the problem with that is that they're getting higher concentrations of nicotine, which makes it much more addictive quicker.
Okay, I went to your website, which I thought was very interesting. So I encourage everybody to go to his website. And there you have a video by Nora Volker.
Yeah, Nora Volkow.
Uh-huh. And she talked about the impact on the brain of the teenagers compared to adult doesn't have to face that because they're developed.
Yes.
I'm thinking. But I thought it was it really made me stop and think why it's so tragic when they get into drugs at this early age.
Yes, that is an essential part that people need to understand. And I have a chapter in my book, a brief chapter on the neuroscience of addiction, which in very layman's terms helps people understand how these drugs work in the adolescent brain. And a key message is that the difference between adults addiction and adolescent addiction is brain development. Our brains are not fully developed until we reach around age 24 or 25. So it's very important for parents to do everything they can to protect their child's brain while it's in that critical process of developing and growing. And drugs like marijuana, can interfere with that process of the brain developing. When I saw a lot of kids who were using marijuana, and these were very bright kids, their IQs were above average to superior, but they were smoking a lot of marijuana. And when the test results came back, what I found was that their short-term memory was impaired. The processing speed of their brain was below average, and their motivation was really low. So these drugs have the potential to really curtail that adolescent brain's development.
Right. There was another word that I got from that video was emotionally it affects them. Is that correct?
It can emotionally affect them. It can affect the development of key areas of the brain, like the processing speed. So, the message is very clear. The adolescent brain is a developing brain. And the younger a person starts to use a drug, the less developed their brain is, and the more chance that they will become truly captured by that drug, and it can do some damage to their brain.
Yeah.
You may not notice those changes right away, because some of them take time to develop. But the more and more we learn about how these drugs work within the brain, the more and more we can see how it affects the brain and can make changes that can be long lasting sometimes.
Yeah. Well, once someone stops using, let's say that they try it for 2-3 years, is there a recovery period? With time, is there a slow recovery, or is it permanent damage from?
No, that's a great question, because in my book, in the chapter on the neuroscience of addiction, I make the point, I think towards the end of the chapter, that our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves. Once we stop the drug use, our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves and to recover from the damage that was done. Now, will it ever recover 100%? Well, that depends. It depends on how young the person was when they started. It depends on the drugs they were using, and it depends on how long they were using. The longer you use, the more damage, and the longer the recovery. But regardless of that, the message is our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves, so that once a person gets into treatment and stops using, the brain starts to recover, and we can see some pretty remarkable progress over a period of time.
Yeah. Well, that's a good story. I like that story, but if a parent is totally not connected into this world at all, and they become suspicious or see signs. What are some of the signs that would send red flags?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote my book was to give parents information on what to look for, because, like I said earlier, so many parents would say, "How did I miss the warning signs?" And then they'd start to feel like they weren't a good parent. They were good parents. They missed the warning signs because nobody told them what to look for. But they would feel guilty, and they would say, "How did I miss all of this? How could I not have seen this?" So a big part of my book lists warning signs. There's warning signs for alcohol use and for marijuana use. There's warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder or might be self-harming themselves, because sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes a child might be developing an eating disorder or might be self-harming, and they're also using a substance. So it's important to know what those early warning signs are for those as well. As a general rule, the book has specific warning signs, but as a general rule, I say to parents, pay attention to the changes you see in your child. You know your child better than anyone, so pay attention to those changes. Don't assume that the changes you're seeing are just normal adolescent acting out. They might very well be, but they also might be an indication that there's something else going on underneath the surface. So some examples would be a child whose grades are starting to decline. A child who used to be very outgoing and social now becomes very quiet and secretive and isolating. A child who used to participate in sports no longer wants to participate in sports. A child who used to openly introduce you to their friends, you knew who their friends were, you might have even known who their family members were, now becomes very secretive of who their friends are. So the more of these warning signs that you see, and the longer these warning signs last, the more concerned you should be, and really get some professional advice as to what you're seeing.
Yeah. I just have to bring this up because the family unit in so many families is so weak. And so have we seen an increase because of the how do I want to say this? Because of the help me here, Rick. You know what I'm saying.
No.
The falling apart of the family. I think it really is. And I mean, I'm an example of a divorce. I mean, there are so many of these traumatic things that happen to the family anymore.
I think that's a valid point. I think as the family structure and the unity in the family starts to deteriorate and fall apart, that has an effect on everybody in the family. It has effect on the husband, the wife. Certainly, it has an effect on siblings, and it can be very traumatic time for kids. Some of those kids may turn to getting relief in a substance. So as I was saying, the route to getting into this varies from child to child, but there's no question that the family structure and what's going on in the family system can affect, children very much so.
Right. All right. So let's say that a parent has suspect here that this is different. He's not the boy we used to have or the girl we used to have. And so they're really trying to search out. The first thing would be to go to find your book. We want them to go get your book.
Yes.
And you also have a workbook with that. How does the workbook support the book?
Well, I wrote the workbook because so many times we put the emphasis on the child who's using a substance, and we forget that the parent needs help too, because they're going through their own crisis.
Yes.
So I wrote this brief workbook. It's very brief, but it has a number of exercises where the parent can work through everything that they're going through, or a lot of things that they're going through. It has a section where the parent will write a letter to their child. They don't have to share it with their child, but they write a letter to their child expressing how they're feeling about everything that's going on and how it's affecting them and how it's affecting their family. There's a brief exercise on how to cope with anxiety, because many parents are dealing with a lot of anxiety during this time. So there's an exercise, a breathing exercise to help with that. And then there's an important section, a very brief section on how to communicate. And the point I'm making with that is we're usually pretty good at listening to each other's words when we talk. Sometimes we're not so good at listening to the feelings that are beneath those words. So there's some examples on how, as a parent, you can begin to listen not just to your child's words, but you can listen and reflect back the feelings behind those words. And when you can do that, you create a very powerful communication system with your child. It's a skill every parent can practice and every parent can learn, but it does take some time.
Right.
But that workbook is entirely meant to support the parent. And it is a companion to the book. So I recommend people get both.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Communication is really one thing that we're not so good in. Communication. I mean, I've interviewed several people in grief, and talking to somebody about grief is like talking. We don't want to talk about it. We just want to do something else. And I would think talking about drugs is about the same way. We don't want to talk about it.
That's absolutely right. Many parents want to avoid the subject because they're scared of it. And they think that if they don't talk about it, that it won't happen. So they don't want to talk about it and they don't want to learn anything about it. And that's a very dangerous attitude to have, because that runs the risk of eventually you end up being a parent that comes back and says, I don't understand how all this happened. I don't understand how I missed the warning signs. So sometimes burying our head in the sand is not the best approach to dealing with a problem, especially one that can be as serious as your child using a substance.
Well, I love that you put the communication part in your book, because we need help in knowing how to ask the questions, what the questions are, the words you could use. I mean, just baby steps almost, but still they're learning steps for a lot of people.
And it's a very, in the workbook, it's a very simple exercise. It's not 10, 15, 20 different things that you have to do. It's just basically, it's how you phrase the question. It's coming from an inquiring point of view, not an accusing point of view, so that when you're talking with your child, you might be saying something, well, I'm seeing these behaviors and I'm curious as to what's going on, as opposed to accusing the child of doing something. So again, that's a skill that takes a little bit of practice, because we're not used to talking to each other that way. We're not used to listening for the feelings. We're more in tune to listening to the words, and then we react to the words and we completely miss out on the feelings. So it's a skill that parents can practice and they can learn.
So, okay, so let's say they've bought your book, they've used the workbook. When do they go to a skilled therapist? Now, there's therapy and then there's therapy. Okay. And so the wonderful thing about being in this generation is that we can go to the best over the internet. Could we have come to you if we had been in Tyler, Texas and wanted to talk to you? Did you do any work through the computer?
No, I did not. I was on the staff at Menninger Clinic, so we would get.
But do they have such a support system?
Well, there is a support system, but when you first discover or believe your child might be using a substance, my recommendation is to, number one, read the section in my book that talks about assessments, because it's going to tell you what type of test and assessments you need to get done, what kind of professionals you need to rely on. For example, you're certainly going to need an addictions assessment. That's pretty much what I was doing. That's going to help you understand what drugs your child's been using, how long they've been using them, and what kind of a diagnosis, if any, is appropriate. but you'll also need a psychological or a neuropsychological assessment to either rule in or rule out whether there's an underlying emotional issue that your child might be coping with by using a substance. So that chapter in my book sort of guides parents in terms of, okay, I think there's a problem. What kind of assessments do I need to get done, and who do I need to turn to?
So you could get them done in your community, those assessments?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh,
You know, and if you need help on where to find people that would do that, you can start with the school counselor. You can
yes,
talk to the school social worker. Many
yeah.
times they can do some of these assessments. If
Mm.
not, they can refer you to professionals in the community that can do those assessments.
Oh, well, see, I didn't know about that.
Most people don't.
I've been away from high school for a while.
Yeah.
So, you know, the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, you talked about the pandemic and how it's affected the teen,
Yeah.
but, you know, it's thrown all of us into a crazy, you know, nothing is the same. So they can't help but be affected. So what are the ways they're affected by this upheaval that we've been going through?
I think you're absolutely right. This pandemic has affected parents, it's affected children, it's disrupted everybody's life. You
Mhm.
know, it's disrupted people's work schedule, it's disrupted their home life. If you're a kid, it's disrupted their school life. And it's gone on and on and on and on and on for quite some time, for well over a
Yes.
year. What we're beginning to see, I think we're just now scratching the surface on how this pandemic has affected the mental health of adults as well as adolescents.
Mhm.
You know, for one thing that we're beginning to see is that the Centers for Disease Control has reported that since the pandemic began, there has been a significant increase in the number of adolescents who are showing up at emergency rooms needing mental health care. So this
Ah,
pandemic has affected the mental health of adults. It's affecting the mental health of children. And I think that we're just now beginning to see, and we're going to continue to see for some time what those effects are. And now that kids are moving back into the traditional classroom setting, we may see some of those kids who are going to exhibit some issues as they try to readjust to the regular academic setting as well. So I think
yeah.
we just need to be aware that this is going to be a difficult transition for a lot of kids. For some, it won't be, but for others, it may be. And we just need to be prepared to support families and to support children as they transition back to the regular classroom. But there's no
Well,
effect that the pandemic has affected the mental health of both adults, families, and kids.
yeah. So what give me an example of a mental health that could affect a child. How would they notice that? Fear, doubt, are they that is that what you're talking about?
Well, I think for a lot of kids, you know, anxiety
Yeah.
can be a major issue. For example, the anxiety of returning to the classroom after having been away from it for a year or more. The anxiety associated with having to reestablish those friendships and those relationships.
Mhm.
The anxiety of getting into a more traditional school day as opposed to sitting at home on a computer where you're in and out of the classroom, so to speak. So
Yeah.
anxiety, I think, can be a number one issue that can bother kids. And some of them, as I was saying earlier, might turn to a substance to relieve that anxiety. For other
Yeah.
kids, it might be the fact that maybe they're struggling against some type of depression. Maybe it's a low grade depression that parents might not notice, but it's
Right.
there. And for
Yeah.
some kids, it might be an issue of maybe having been bullied at school that the parents weren't aware of,
Yeah.
or being abused at school that the parents weren't aware of. So there could be a
Mhm.
lot of emotional issues that are going on, and that's why
Mhm.
it's so important if you suspect that there's an issue issue with drugs, or you suspect there's an issue with depression or anxiety, that you turn to the professionals to get the assessments done
Right.
and get the professional advice. And if it is a problem, the professional recommendations on how to deal with it.
Yeah. Do you think this is just one of the battlefields that we've experienced? Do you think that the wearing the mask will they be affected because of that? Or do they understand it's healthy, it keeps them safe? Is that, would that cause, well, it could cause more anxiety, but would it cause fear? And I mean, it's a sign of the time. I think it's very important to wear the mask.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, I know they're all going to be happy, as every one of us will be, when we throw that mask away and and don't have to deal with it. Or I have to walk back to my car 100 times to get my mask because I forget it.
Yeah.
But I mean, is there an effect that they may experience from this?
I think kids take their cue from their parents.
Yeah.
So if you have a parent that is exhibiting wearing the mask in situations where it's appropriate to do so,
Yeah.
where the parent encourages their child to practice, safety and health measures, to wear the mask in high risk situations when they're around other people, common sense approach as to when to wear a mask and not to wear a mask. I think kids will take their cue from that. And it can go a lot of different ways. It can go from, a child learning that it's not all that important from a parent who doesn't think it's important, to the other extreme where parents get paranoid about this, and then the child gets paranoid about it and won't go anywhere without a mask. So it's important that parents understand that their attitude towards this pandemic and how they approach being safe in this pandemic is going to be transmitted to their kids.
Yes. Yeah. So you're a grandfather, a father, a grandfather. So how have you seen that this pandemic has affected your grandchildren?
Well, one of my granddaughters, who is a freshman in high school, is what I would consider almost paranoid about this, where she is afraid to go places without wearing a mask. She almost insists that everybody else wear a mask. And she's getting that from her parents, who are also paranoid about this whole issue. So that's an example of how the parents' approach this can directly affect the child. Now, her sister, who's 2 years younger, takes a completely different approach. She'll wear a mask when when she thinks it's appropriate, but she has no problem not wearing it when it's not needed. So they go two different extremes on that. But what I've noticed from it is that kids tend to take their signs from their parents when it comes to wearing a mask.
Yeah, I agree. I so agree. That's just how we get into our parents are such good models for addiction, for if alcohol's in the home, it's much freer. They get to it and they see them have a drink every night. It's just so important, our modeling for our children.
It is,
take on.
Sometimes people will ask me, well, is it okay for parents to allow their children to drink alcohol if they tell their children you can only drink in the home? I don't want you drinking anywhere else, but you can drink here. And my answer is, well, the research shows that for parents who have that kind of an attitude, that their kids can drink at home but not away, that the research shows that when those kids leave home and go off to college, they end up drinking more than parents who said you shouldn't be drinking at all while you're at home. So that kind of an attitude, the research would say those kids who were allowed to drink at home will end up drinking even more as they leave home.
So if they have a tendency, well, you wouldn't know this, but if they have a tendency to drink, there's not really training. I mean, that's a crazy question. How do you prepare somebody for that life? College is a drinking life. So how do you prepare a young person for that?
I think that you prepare them by just raising them, educating them, helping to understand that, if they drink when it's legal, um, that it's very important that they drink in moderation.
Mhm.
Talk to them about the risk of what happens when a person becomes intoxicated.
Yeah.
Reinforced to them that although they've gone off to college, their brain's not going to be fully developed until they're 24 or 25. So
Wow.
their brain is still developing while they're in college. So binge drinking, excessive alcohol drinking, even if it's legal, carries with it a lot of risk.
Yeah.
There's many risks for it. But it all begins at home. It all begins with the parent's attitude and the parent's education and how that child is led to believe, what they're led to believe about drinking alcohol or using drugs.
Right. Yeah. But do they get that message in school anymore or ever? Would they even listen in a room of teens?
The way that drug education is approached in our schools, in my opinion, is not very effective because
Yeah.
it tends to be, well, let's spend a little bit of time talking about it. We'll have an assembly. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about it in health class when they get in high school, and that's a very ineffective way of dealing with this. Also,
Mhm.
what is ineffective is to tell kids, well, it's illegal and you shouldn't be doing it. And if you do, these bad things are going to happen to you. Your grades are going to decline. You might not graduate. They don't care about that. They don't
Yeah.
believe it.
Right.
But what does work with them is the neuroscience approach. They're curious about how their brain works. They're curious about what drugs do to the brain. So if you want to
Right.
get a kid's attention, take the neuroscience approach. I would start in the elementary grades where I started
Mm.
to teach kids about the brain, not drugs,
Yeah.
not alcohol, but just teach
Right.
them about the brain, how the brain works, what the different areas of the brain are and how they work, and what the different areas of the brain do and what they're responsible for. I would
Mhm.
start that in the elementary grades every single year. And then as they get into junior high, middle school, and high school, I would start to introduce the concept of how these drugs can affect that brain. So in elementary school, I've taught them about the brain. When they
Mhm.
get to middle school and high school, I've transitioned into, okay, now you know about the brain, you've learned about that. Now let's take a look at how these drugs and alcohol can affect the brain. And I would do that every single year through middle school and high school.
You're not leaving that. Are you saying the school would do that or parents would do that?
I'm saying the school should take the
Ah,
responsibility of the education of it because
yeah.
that really comes down to educating the child,
Right.
educating them initially about the brain, the
Right.
science of the brain, and then when they get later in their school years, educating them about how drugs work within that developing brain.
Right.
So first the child learns in elementary grades what the brain is and how it works and how important it is and that it's going to be developing for the next 23, 24, 25 years. Then when they get to middle school and high school, then they start to learn about what things can do to the brain.
Oh, yes. Has Menninger sort of laid out a structure for this type of educational process?
No, Menninger is basically a psychiatric hospital.
Yeah.
So they deal with assessment and treatment.
So who would create this
It should be up
course?
to the local school district. Should be the local board
Oh,
of education and the teachers and the leadership in the school that incorporates this within the overall curriculum.
ah, okay. All right. I think that would be a good thing. But right now they're so busy just trying to stay open.
Yeah,
Now,
they are busy.
so what have we discussed all of the treatment options that are possible available for teens that do need treatment?
Well, that's a great question because there is no one treatment that affects every child. There's no one treatment that is appropriate for every single child. Every child's different. Every situation is different. Every diagnosis and treatment plan is different. They're individualized. In
Yeah.
my book, I have a section that helps parents understand what is a good evidence-based treatment program. What do you look for? What are the questions as a parent you should be asking a treatment provider? What questions should you be asking?
Oh, that
Especially
was good.
if
Yeah.
your child's going to a treatment program.
Right.
But the range of options, first of all, you get the assessment,
Mm-hmm.
then you get the diagnoses, and then you get a treatment plan, which is a course of action.
Yes.
And that treatment plan really is based upon the assessments. So depending on the assessments and what they show, your child may do very well in an outpatient program where they see somebody maybe once or twice a week. Or your child may need what's referred to as an intensive treatment program where they might see somebody 3 or 4 times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Or if the situation is really serious and the diagnosis warranted, your child may be recommended for a residential program where they go off to a program and they're there 7 days a week for weeks and sometimes months. But what treatment option is available and recommended, that's based upon the assessments. And I have a chapter in my book that explains the different treatment options, but it's really based on the assessments that are done. How serious is this problem? The more serious the problem, and if there's an underlying psychological issue, it may be that residential treatment program is important. For children who have both a substance use and a mental issue like anxiety or depression or an emerging personality disorder, it's important that both of those get treated. You can't just treat the marijuana use and ignore the anxiety. You have to treat both.
Yeah. Yeah. And that would a teenager be more likely to have to, well, you say it's individual. So, okay.
The one thing I will say is that as a parent, be prepared for your child to resist getting the assessments and getting the treatment. They're going to tell you no. But as a parent, you probably have heard your child say no to you a lot. So it's not going to be anything new. But in this instance, when it comes to substance use, it's very important that as a parent, you hold the line, you insist that the assessments get done. And if treatment is required, you insist that the child go to treatment.
Right. Yeah. Yes. That's a very stressful, difficult time in a family's life.
It is.
Oh my gosh.
It is very stressful. And that's why I say to parents, if you're going through this, get some support for yourself. Get some help for yourself. Maybe it's another relative. Maybe it's a close friend. Maybe it's a professional counselor. But take care of yourself, recognizing that you're going through a very difficult time yourself. You're going through a crisis yourself. So reach out and get help for yourself as you're going through this process. Don't try to go it alone. Get some help.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really important. Yes, I went through part of that with my husband that was the alcoholic. And yes, I had the support system because he did go to a retreat center. But yeah, people don't think, they don't think about it being a family disease. It is a family disease.
It is.
And everybody needs to be treated, basically.
That's an excellent point because it doesn't just affect the person who's using. It doesn't just affect the child, say. It affects the entire family situation. Siblings, husband, wife, everybody is affected by it because everybody is going through it. You know, it's not just the kid, it's the entire family. And sometimes the family the family itself needs treatment.
Yes, I agree. In the book, I know, why did you feel so compelled to write this book? Is that there just are so few instructional books like that? Or did you feel the message that you had coming from the history you've had with Menninger, that was needed to be published?
It was from the history of working at Menninger and meeting with
Mhm,
so many parents and watching the struggle that they went through and
mhm,
listening to them about how they wish they would have known what the warning signs were, how they wish they would have known how to intervene sooner. Because when their child gets to the point where they come to Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, it has become a major life-threatening crisis.
yeah,
And many times there is a very serious underlying emotional issue that hasn't been treated. Sometimes
mhm,
it's anxiety or depression, or it might be an emerging personality type of thing, but it has
yeah,
become such a crisis that the child has to go into the hospital. So
yeah,
listening to these parents and seeing their struggle with this led me to want to put this resource together so that parents and anyone interested in this can hopefully feel a little bit better informed, a little bit more confident, and less afraid of this subject. And that was my motivation for wanting to do it, to help these families.
yeah. I I just applaud you for doing this, because it's a tool that people need, that they can get at home. They can go to a bookstore, they can order it on your website, or they can get it from Amazon too, right?
Yes, you can get it through Amazon,
Everywhere.
or you can go to the book's website and it'll have a link that'll take you directly to Amazon.
Uh-huh.
The book is available as a Kindle for people who like to read on a Kindle.
Yes.
And it's also available in paperback for people who like to write in books and underline and highlight and maybe keep it on the bookshelf. You may not need it right now, but it'll be a resource for you, or it can be a resource for somebody down the road that may be struggling with this, and you can pull it off your bookshelf and say, here, read this.
Yeah, what a great thing to give somebody. But the workbook, of course, is for writing in.
Yes.
So they would want to buy, would they buy one for each adult in the family? I
I
mean,
would
the
recommend,
husband, wife?
yeah, I would recommend that. I think that's an excellent idea. I think both the husband and the wife should read the book together and talk
Mhm,
about it.
mhm.
And then I think that if their child is going through this, then I think the workbook can be helpful for both the husband and the wife.
Yeah,
But I think to begin with, and especially if you have a child that you don't think is using the substance, or maybe is a preteen, you want to get the book and have both yourself and your husband or wife read this book and talk about it, and hopefully feel a little bit more prepared to deal with it if you have to.
yes, yeah. I think what's interesting, and the reason I thought about that, is that, couples may talk, but women think differently from men. And you don't want to be influenced. You want to keep your own thoughts
Yeah,
so that you can share them, and
exactly.
and be we don't have to apologize for the way we feel. We just get it different. I don't know if you've noticed. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
think I think I think I've noticed.
we are different.
You have a
So,
different view of things sometimes, a different perspective, which can be very valuable,
yeah,
because we always don't see things the same way, which
yeah,
means we can learn from one another.
yes, yes. So I really think that would be a great tool for the couple
Yes.
to do this journey together.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I do make the point in the workbook that both the husband and wife, should work together, fill it out. Both
Yes.
husband and wife should read the book so
Uh-huh.
that they're both coming from the same perspective. They both have the same knowledge. They both know, if they have to get assessments, what assessments should be done. It doesn't all fall on one spouse to have to take the initiative and learn what to do. It really is a partnership. So both of
Mhm.
them should have the information.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking probably each one should get their own copy of both books, because even a wife would underscore different words.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
the husband, I mean, it's just the difference in man and woman.
Well, and let's just take the workbook, for example. There's an exercise where you write a letter to your child. You don't
Mhm.
have to share it with your child, but you write a letter to your child and you talk about how this is affecting you. Well, a wife's going to write a different letter than a husband.
Oh,
So,
indeed.
so if they both have a copy of the workbook, they're both writing their own letter.
Yes, 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 valuable. Well, I am just, we're coming to the end of our hour, and it's just like you've given us so much information. Thank you for coming on Second Wind, because, everybody is touched by this disease. Everybody. And so it is just imperative that we have these tools. They make life so much easier. And,
Yeah,
and it's when we're lost that we don't know what to do. So
that's right.
your book is just really needed. I can
Well,
see
well,
that.
thank you.
Mm.
If you get questions, or you think of issues that we didn't get to talk about, or
Yeah,
people bring issues to you or questions that
yeah.
they wished we would have discussed, if they can get those to you, just reach out to me and I'll be happy to come back and we can have another conversation where we address specific questions and issues that perhaps we didn't get to today.
I'd love to do that. And if anybody has questions, you can address it to Joyce at secondwindwithjoyce@gmail.com. And that'll get to me. So I can have those questions. They'll pop up on my website, email. I do have 3 questions that I'd like to ask my guests. So I want you to join the group. So here they are, Rick.
Okay.
What is the most important action needed to face the fear of the transition that someone would be going through? You believe.
I think just to recognize that you have power over that fear, that you don't have to let that fear control you.
Mhm.
And just to be able, first of all, to sit with the fear and not try to avoid it, just to recognize that it's there, that it's a normal human emotion. We all have fears. We all
Mhm.
fear something or many things, and that's normal, and
Mhm.
that it's a thought, and that the thought is not actually going to hurt us.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Would you share any pitfall to avoid on their uh, journey to help their teenager or face this alcoholic or addiction problem?
There's going to be pitfalls everywhere. You're going to fall
Oh
into
gosh, it's like a mine.
you're going to fall into so many pits. um, but but each time
What?
you but each time you fall into a pit and you climb yourself out, you end up becoming stronger. So don't look at pitfalls as being the end. Look at them as being challenges and learning opportunities. And if you can look back at a pitfall and walk away saying that you learned something from it, it's
Mhm.
not a failure, it's a success.
I love that, Rick. I do love that, because sometimes we think they are they are signs that stop us. Oh, I must stop. But no, we keep going. It's just keep going up the ladder.
Yeah.
Keep going through the pitfalls, marking them off. What is your greatest success?
I think my greatest success is my son, that I raised,
Mhm.
and he is now in his 30s. He's a paramedic.
Mhm.
He works here in Texas. So he is, without a doubt, my greatest accomplishment.
Oh, that's great. Yes. Kept him in the medical area.
And he chose it himself.
Good. Well, thank you for doing this, for being on Second Wind. I believe the listener has walked away with a lot of information today. And so I really appreciate that you chose to be here.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to have me on the program. I appreciate your input and your observations. I think they made for a more enlightening conversation, and your humor as well. But I hope that we have provided some information to the listeners, and I would encourage everyone to go out and go to the book's website, which is helptheaddictedchild.com.
Yes.
helptheaddictedchild.com, where you can read endorsements and book reviews, and order the book. I would encourage everybody to order the book as a Kindle or as a paperback. It won't take you long to read it. Put it on the bookshelf if it's a paperback, and have it as a handy reference or something you can share with other people. So, take advantage of the information that's there.
Yes, I will. Yes, I will agree with you that your website was very beneficial to me in gathering information and just educating me. Your blogs are wonderful.
Great.
I read a couple of those, and I was very interested in what you were saying and what a help it could be for parents.
Great.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yes. Now, for you listeners out there, you have a great opportunity to share some valuable information. If you're not being touched by addiction, you have the possibility of supporting somebody, guiding somebody to a site that can make this transition, this experience easier for them. So you may want to do it by getting the book, or you may just refer to this podcast, whatever. Reach out to your neighbor that is suffering through this horrible experience of adolescent substance abuse. It is a big part of our life, and there are people out there looking for answers. So you have so much power this week to share, and I hope that you will, if you get that opportunity to do so. Other than that, the only thing I ask is that you share this podcast, because that way they'll get to experience Rick and his words of wisdom, and hopefully become part or supported by his book, and help somebody yourself. So anyway, thank you for being here. It's always my pleasure. I love being here. I love being here. I love talking to my guests. I love. So you love, and have a great week.
Joyce Buford returns next week at the same time for another edition of Second Wind. Through the Joyce Buford Empowerment System, women are receiving the support they need through their transitions and are able to reclaim their true purpose with confidence. They receive the tools they need to map out new lives. You can find out more about her coaching services at joycebufordempowers.com.